This is the true story of Jim Carroll's life, a lesson for youth that every young person should watch to understand how one wrong decision can ruin their entire life. The story begins in a classroom where a boy named Jim is severely punished by his teacher. Just then, the period bell rings. Jim tells his teacher, "You don't know how to hit properly." "I had started enjoying it." The teacher replies, "We can start again tomorrow." After that, Jim leaves with his 3 best friends, Petrol, Mickey, and Neutron. They all smoke, act mischievously, and never think before doing things. They even inhale thinner-soaked clothes to get high. Despite all this, Jim is an exceptional basketball player. His school team faces another school in a basketball match where Jim performs brilliantly, leading his team to victory. However, during the game, Jim's friend sneaks into the locker room and steals money, watches, and other valuables from the opposing team. Later, when they leave the restaurant, the rival team confronts them, demanding their belongings back. Jim and his friends deny the theft, resulting in a big fight, and Jim and his friends manage to escape. Later, Jim visits a hospital where he meets Bobby, his closest friend and once the best basketball player on their team. Bobby was diagnosed with leukemia 2 years ago, but Jim believes Bobby will fight through it. Jim continues to spend all his time with his 3 mischievous friends, often engaging in reckless activities. Apart from basketball, Jim has another passion, writing. Whenever he has time or a thought crosses his mind, he writes it down in his notebook. A few days later, Jim's friend Bobby passes away. When Jim goes to see him, Bobby looks like a skeleton, even though he's only 16 years old but appears 60. This deeply upsets Jim, and nothing feels right anymore. One evening, after watching a movie with his friends, Jim realizes he can't even remember what the film was about. While Bobby's death barely affects Jim's 3 friends, Jim feels devastated inside. One day, Jim visits a place where people are using heroin. Although he's terrified of needles, he tries heroin for the first time. Afterward, his sadness, pain, and mental prison seem to vanish. He feels like he's running through a field of flowers, and everything around him feels pleasant. However, when Jim returns home, his mom sees his state and feels heartbroken. Despite her efforts to understand, Jim coldly tells her, "You don't know anything." Gradually, Jim and his friends become addicted to heroin. What started as a once-a-week habit turned into a daily need. Since heroin is expensive, they need money. One day, the group robs an elderly woman on a dark street, with one of Jim's friends even hurting her. The next day at their school's church, where attendance is compulsory, Jim refuses to join the confession. When the father asks why, Jim says, "I'm not in the mood today." The father responds, "Perhaps that's exactly when you need it most." Jim eventually goes to the confession room. Jim wants to confess about his drug use and heroin addiction but struggles to express it. He desperately wants to quit but convinces himself each time that the next hit will be his last, but that last time never comes. Addiction controls him now. One day, while using drugs in the school bathroom, Jim's coach walks in. Jim hides his tablets, but the coach senses something suspicious. The coach offers Jim money in exchange for sexual favors. Jim angrily refuses, pushes the coach away, and ends up causing the coach's nose to bleed. The coach begs Jim to keep quiet and offers him money as a bribe. Jim accepts the money but warns the coach never to speak to him like that again. Although the coach knows about Jim's drug problem, things spiral further as their basketball match approaches. Jim and his friends were deeply immersed in their addiction, regularly taking pills. One day, their 4th friend, Neutron, shows up and warns them not to take the pills. However, ignoring his advice, Jim and the other 2 friends consume them. During their basketball match, Jim and his friend who had taken the pills perform terribly. They can barely see the ball and end up losing the game badly. Their 3rd friend, who also took the pills, wasn't even playing. He was the one who had previously stolen valuables from the opposing team. The school's father arrives with the police, aware that they've been using drugs. They searched the students' lockers but found nothing since the boys had already consumed the pills. Despite this, the father suspends them for a week, and their coach permanently removes them from the team. Jim, furious, declares, "You can't kick me off the team. I quit your team and this school forever." The father accepts Jim's resignation. Jim and his 2 friends leave the school, while Neutron, who hadn't taken any drugs, remains behind. When Jim returns home, his mother confronts him about his suspension. Jim lies, claiming they were framed and hadn't taken any pills. His mother then reveals the pills she had found hidden at home, asking, "Are these your vitamins?" Enraged, Jim lashes out at her. His mother, heartbroken and unable to tolerate his behavior, tells him to leave the house. Jim storms out, and his mother throws his cherished basketball trophy out the window. Jim picks up the shattered trophy, drops it into a garbage bin, and walks away, declaring that he will never return home. His mother pleads with him, saying, "Please don't say that," because she deeply loves him and doesn't want to see him destroy his life. Now homeless and addicted, Jim and his friends start stealing cars and spending time with other addicts. Their world becomes one of endless intoxication, completely disconnected from reality. To them, this chaotic, drug-fueled life feels like the only real world, and they no longer care about anything else. Jim and his friends' habits worsened over time. They even resorted to stealing from stores. During one such theft, Jim's friend Mickey found an empty gun without bullets. Desperate and with no money, they realized the police were approaching. Jim and Mickey told their third friend Pedro they had to leave, but Pedro, heavily intoxicated, started hallucinating, believing he was in an ice cream parlor. Unable to reason with him, Jim and Mickey fled, leaving Pedro behind, who was later arrested by the police. Jim and Mickey went to a bar where they saw a news report on TV. Their former basketball teammates had been selected for the All-American High School Games and were making their families proud. One of the boys even waved to his mom on TV. This hit Jim and Mickey hard. That could have been them if they had stayed on the right path. Later, Jim secretly visited his home and saw his mom carrying groceries inside. He wanted to talk to her but couldn't gather the courage and walked away, returning to his drug den. A boy confronted Jim, blaming him for giving his girlfriend a dangerously strong dose of drugs that nearly killed her. Jim tried to explain it wasn't his fault, but the boy attacked him and pushed him off a stairway. Jim's mind started spiraling. He hallucinated intensely, imagining himself playing basketball, getting shot, and seeing the basketball net engulfed in flames. In his hallucination, he believed he was still wearing his basketball uniform, but in reality, he was in his regular clothes. For Jim, drugs had become an uncontrollable dream, one he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. Jim ended up nearly frozen on a snow-covered basketball court. A man, an old friend who once practiced basketball with Jim, found him in this miserable state. Knowing Jim's potential as a great player, the man took him home and cared for him. When Jim woke up the next morning, he tried to leave, but upon checking his pocket, he realized his drugs were missing. He demanded them from the man, but the man firmly refused, saying, "I won't let you ruin your life anymore." Ricky grabs Jim's drugs and flushes them down the sink right in front of him. This devastates Jim completely. Furious and desperate, Jim storms out. Jim, unable to cope without them, feels trapped. Ricky, stronger and more composed, refuses to let Jim leave. When Jim asks why he's doing this, Ricky replies, "Because someone once helped me too, and I'm still grateful for it." Jim begs and pleads with Ricky, but Ricky doesn't budge. Jim starts feeling dizzy, his vision blurring. Ricky sits outside the room's door, determined to keep Jim safe. Once Jim starts calming down, Ricky tells him he has to go to work, but will return the next morning. Before leaving, Ricky says, "When you write your book, mention my name." Ricky knew Jim always kept a notebook in his pocket. It was his way of expressing his thoughts. Alone, Jim struggles to stay in control. His mind spins again, and he frantically searches his house for money but finds nothing. Desperate, he visits a girl named Diana, someone deeply involved in drugs and prostitution. In the past, Diana once asked Jim and his friends for money when she was struggling, but back then, Jim mocked her. Now, Jim finds himself standing exactly where Diana once stood. He begs her for money. At first, Diana refuses, but after Jim desperately pleads, she throws some cash on the ground as if giving it to a beggar, and then walks away. Jim angrily yells after her, "I know what you are, you're a prostitute." But as she leaves, Jim still picks up the money. He's now reached a point where pride, respect, and dignity no longer matter. All he wants is enough money to buy drugs. The money Jim gathers isn't enough to buy heroin, so he resorts to something he never thought he'd do, engaging in a degrading act with an old man in a public restroom. While not exactly prostitution, Jim's desperation for drugs drives him to an extreme. With the money, he finds his friend Mickey, and together they visit a drug dealer. The dealer gives them heroin, but when they test it, they realize it's fake. Furious, they chase the dealer. In a tense moment, Mickey confronts him on a rooftop. As Mickey grabs him, the dealer slips and falls off the roof, dying instantly. Jim panics, realizing how deep they've sunk. Mickey flees, but gets caught by a gang, beaten badly, and arrested by the police. Meanwhile, Jim returns home still craving drugs. Desperate, he begs his mom for $5, but his mom refuses to let him in, knowing he'll use the money for drugs. Despite loving him deeply, she calls the police, hoping jail might save him. When the police arrive, Jim pleads with his mom, promising to change, but it's too late. He's arrested and sentenced to 6 months in jail. During his time in jail, Jim finishes writing his diary. Upon release, he stands outside a stage door where he's scheduled to read his poetry. There, he meets his old friend Pedro, who had been arrested earlier but is now free. Pedro offers Jim drugs again, but Jim firmly refuses, stating he can't go back to that life. He tells Pedro to take care of himself before heading on stage. Jim performs his poetry, earning applause and appreciation. The story ends by revealing that Jim completed his diary, titled The Basketball Diaries, at just 17 years old. By 22, he had published 3 volumes of poetry and recorded 4 albums. He continued to live in New York as a musician, novelist, and performer until 2009. Jim Carroll's story is a powerful reminder that no matter how tempting some things may seem, they can never truly fulfill us. Addiction, in particular, can destroy lives if not confronted in time. If Jim hadn't overcome his addiction, his life may have ended tragically, and the world would have never known his name. Jim Carroll is known worldwide today because he fought against addiction, battled himself, and ultimately triumphed to achieve success in his life. In an interview, Jim once said that if you want to quit drugs, the only thing that can truly help you is your inner willpower. Nothing else can free you from addiction. I hope you enjoyed this inspiring story.